Hello and welcome, everyone. Good evening. My name is William Roca. I'm the Director of Programs here at Village Preservation. We're so glad you could join us this evening for this presentation of Early Survivors, Traces of 18th Century Manhattan with Anthony Bellov. Before we get started, just some quick introductions and a little Zoom housekeeping. The chat is open. And so please feel free right now, drop in. Where are you tuning in from? We love to know where everyone is coming from, far and wide and local. Just to tell you a little bit about village preservation, if you are not familiar with us, we have been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand and extend landmark and zoning protections and stop inappropriate development while also encouraging appropriate development in our neighborhoods. We have secured landmark designations for more than 1,250 buildings in our neighborhoods and zoning protections for nearly 100 blocks. We host about 75 free programs like this throughout the year. So we hope that you'll join us for some future upcoming programs. Here are the next two coming up after the week after Thanksgiving. So we hope you'll consider joining us for those programs. Please take a look on our website to learn more about those. But overall, our programs focus on a wide range of topics on history, architecture, and culture of Greenwich Village, East Village, and NoHo, and cover historic preservation and the role it plays in our communities and lives. We also like to talk about all the social justice movements, civil rights, cultural institutions, great artists, writers, musicals, dancers, and all the other creative legacy of our neighborhoods. Now, we are a members-based organization. So if you are already a village preservation member, a huge thank you to you because you help make these possible, these programs. If you haven't become a member yet, please consider becoming a member by heading over to our website, villagepreservation.org/donate. Now for some Zoom protocol. You please submit any questions you have in the Q&A button that you see there at the bottom. We're going to be collecting those questions throughout the presentation. You can put your question in at any time, and then we'll be asking those questions to tonight's speaker at the end of the presentation. So now to introduce this evening's speaker, Anthony Bellov. He's a well-known resident of Bloomingdale in the Upper West Side. He's award-winning videographer, classical pianist and tenor, singing teacher, architectural historian, photographer, and preservationist. He holds a bachelor's degree in architecture from Pratt Institute and a master's in museum leadership from the Bank Street College of Education. And he's been an artist member of the prestigious Salmagundi Club, where he recently presented a lecture series there before Salmagundi, including with us at Village Preservation before I joined as Director of Programs. And this explores transformations of the 1853 Fifth Avenue mansion over the years. That series can be enjoyed on YouTube, including the Village Preservation's YouTube channel. So I'm going to hand it over to Anthony. Please take it away. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then I will vanish in the shadows. Thank you, Anthony, and welcome.
Let's see if it works. It worked. Okay.
Fantastic.
I'm very pleased about that. Good evening. Thank you, William and Maya. Thank you for your help this evening. And hello to everybody. I am thrilled that people literally are viewing this from all over the world. So thank you very much for tuning in. And before I begin jabbering about what we'll be talking about tonight, just a quick shout out to the Bloomingdale Aging in Place, where I first presented a previous form of this talk this past June. Since then, I have tweaked and refined it, but I did want to give them credit where credit was due. So let's take off and just begin talking about the traces of 18th century New York. Manhattan is New York in those days, the equivalent, that still survive today. And of course, now we're not moving forward. There we go. Okay, great. So here we go. First of all, what is a century? Yeah, it seems like a sort of an obvious thing, but a century is a very arbitrary way of dividing time because dividing time is arbitrary. And before there were centuries, there was a subdivision of the Roman legion called a century. So century signifies 100 of something. Centuries really only came to signify a grouping of 100 years after the Christian era began, because before that time they weren't really keeping track. Let's talk about what my selection criteria were for the places we'll be talking about tonight. Number one, the property must be standing above ground, although it may have been relocated. That sounds a little weird for me to say, but those of you who are familiar with Lower Manhattan know that there are foundations sometimes revealed in sidewalks in the very, very southern tip of the island, the old Dutch city, which date back to the 17th century. And you can see them through these sometimes visible, sometimes all fogged over glass panels. So I did not count those. It still needs to be a recognizable structure above ground. Then there's the argument about when did a century begin? Is it 1700 to 1799? Is it 1701 to 1800? That's the century I'm going with because, of course, there was no 0 AD or 0 BC. A whole nother point that I don't need to go into further than that. And my other criteria is it must be politically now in New York County. Because Manhattan and New York City were the equivalent in the 18th century. So now let's talk about the 18th century. I mean, everybody talks about, the 18th century. Yes, we think about beautiful brick-lined streets with brick paving and everything so nice and so quaint, and people just all want to live in these wonderful little houses, sometimes where you practically hit your head on the ceiling. But they looked so nice, or at least they do now. The 18th century is also about our founding fathers. We all know about them, dead white men on paper money. And yes, of course they existed. And yes, of course they were fundamental to the foundations of this country. But when we think of the 18th century architecture, we think of founding fathers, we think of the decorative arts. The 18th century was wonderful for its decorative arts, definitely. But hey, the 17th century had founding fathers and decorative arts too, maybe elsewhere, and so did the 19th century. So how did the 18th century get to be what we all think of as a kind of a magic time today? I already mentioned that the whole concept of a century is an arbitrary way of dating based on a Christian perspective. The 18th century acquired a certain amount of prestige during the later 19th century when the powers that be/were in America, in the United States, were threatened by the influx of immigrants for a lot of non-Anglo cultures. And so the old families, the families that had been here from Dutch and British times, were feeling threatened. And so the colonial revival was an attempt to re-establish their hegemony over a culture, a civilization, which was rapidly changing. So with all of the restorations and the recreations and the idealizations and the romanticizations of the 18th century, we now have this rosy picture of a century that really wasn't very different from any other one. So I think it's important that you appreciate that the idea of the 18th century as some sort of a halcyon age is really something we've been spoon-fed and isn't necessarily the truth. But moving right along, I chose to focus or use as our anchor point for this talk the Commissioner's Map of 1811. Granted, not the 18th century, but this is a map that was drawn up by the commissioners who planned New York City up to 155th Street. If you can see my cursor, It's right here, this demarcation line. They just could not believe that the city was going to grow past that line anytime in the following 200 years. And so they thought that was far enough to create the famous gridiron system, which we all know today. But if you look at the left side of the grid, you'll see the layout of the streets as they existed pretty much until the end of the 18th century. So we'll be referring to this map constantly through my talk this evening. It's a very handy dandy map. I've always wanted a nice big reproduction of it framed and hanging somewhere in my house, but I don't have a wall that large. This is the area that we're really discussing at large today. The circle indicates the area of New York City that was by and large densely developed by the end of the 18th century. So if you look at that and compare it to the rest of the island, you get an idea that the city itself was very limited. Now, many of you probably already know this, but I thought it was definitely worth mentioning. We are going to be largely, but not entirely, focused on the area within that circle. What did New York look like at the end of the 18th century? This is a wonderful engraving from 1797 showing Broad Street. And those of you who know the city today, this low two-story brick building here is now the New York Stock Exchange. This building here, this lovely late Georgian, early Federal town hall looking building, is where Federal Hall, the Greek temple, the Greek Doric temple that stands there now and was the original customs house of New York. This is the building that Washington was inaugurated as first president. Yes, don't forget, New York was the first capital of the United States. And I should add that every single one of these buildings is no longer extant. Why do we lose our 18th century buildings? Progress was the biggest culprit, but there was also simply the fact of age, and some buildings had a tendency to collapse. And then there was that little pesky fire that took place in 1835, which wiped a large number of buildings in Lower Manhattan off the map. And then there was a fire before that in 1776, which took care of a lot of the pre-United States buildings. Different talk, different program. We'll do that maybe some other time. Okay, let's go back for a second. See how nice and clean everything is? I don't believe it. Not for a second. Here's a photo of Rivington Street, actually, 100 years later. I'm sorry, I think this is much more accurate of what New York 100 years prior to this looked like. So keep that in mind, and let's dispel those idealized, romanticized notions of the 18th century. Okay? Okay. Moving right along. I'm going to just zip through this section really quickly because we're going to go back and revisit all of these in greater detail. The oldest building standing on Manhattan Island, and some of you are going to argue with me about this, so bear with me and we'll talk about it some more when we get to it specifically. 54 Pearl Street, which was built in 1719. And if you went any further south of the tip of Manhattan, you'd be in the water. That's how close to the water 54 Pearl Street was when it was built. The next oldest building, we have to jump almost 30 years to 1746, 105 Broad Street. Notice that cluster of stars. Wait a minute now. 20 years later, we're talking about a building way up at the far end of the island, 65 Jumel Terrace, and I'm sure a lot of you know what building I'm talking about. Back down to the lower tip, 209 Broadway, 1766. 273 Water Street, 1773. Then we jump 10 years because something happened between 1773 and 1783, which sort of got in the way of construction. But way up at the northern end of Manhattan, up at 204th Street and Broadway, a building was constructed in 1783. Back down, 1789, 18 Bowery, 1793, 7th State Street, 1794, 279 Water Street. Notice that cluster, it's significant. 44 Stuyvesant Street in 1795, sort of at the upward reach of the city at that point. 1796, the Blackwell House, which is here on Blackwell's Island, what we call Roosevelt's Island today. Politically part of Manhattan, so don't yell at me. 1798, 134, 136 Bowery. 131 East 10th Street, 1799. Again, notice that cluster. Now, all of a sudden, we're jumping uptown to the bucolic East River for a building at 88th Street and East End Avenue, 1799, and another one, a contemporary, built at 421 East 61st Street in 1799. Mind you, none of these addresses above Lower Manhattan, none of the gridiron addresses existed yet. Okay, that's important, not till 1811. And then the last building we'll talk about is 77 Bedford Street, 1800. And notice that it appears to be out in the country because this is Greenwich Village. It's not New York City at that point in time. But of all the survivors, I just want to mention that I think the greatest 18th century survivor is the Lower Manhattan Street Plan. Because it has changed so little since it was first pulled together. And if you can see my cursor right here, I'm drawing a line through Wall Street. Everything below that is the Dutch city. So just the very, very tip of the island was New York, well, New Amsterdam in those days, until 1664, when the British came in and said, guess what? We're going to call it New York from now on. The British city itself ran up to around this point. At one point, it was called Partition Street. Now we know it as Fulton Street. And then by 1801, New York had become the capital for a brief while and was rapidly becoming a very important port city. The city began expanding. Here is City Hall in the Commons in those days. Here's the Collect Pond, which was the only source of fresh water for the city in those days. I'm going to mention the Rutgers farm blocks later on. So just so you know what I'm referring to, it's this area here. One of the first subdivisions of property in New York City that was planned. You can see how gridiron it is. And then for those of you who are members of Village Preservation, or should be, here is Greenwich Village all the way up here. So do you believe me? It really was far away from New York at that time. And this is what New York looked like in 1837. This is a 1900 postcard using an 1837 print and identifying some of the structures in that print. Doesn't look that much different than the 1797 print I showed you earlier. That's important because things changed much more slowly back then. So let's get started. Here we go, Francis Tavern, 1719, and notice I noted sort of 54 Pearl Street. The purists among you are going to argue with me because some people claim that Francis Tavern and the reconstruction is bogus. It's not, okay? It's not a perfectly preserved building, but what building from 1719 is? Certainly not in Manhattan. But when it was restored, well, let's talk about its history. It was built in 1719 as the home of Stephen Delancey. By 1730, it had already become a public facility. It was a tavern, it was a meeting place, a meeting hall. So the Delanceys held on to it for just a short while because the neighborhood around it was changing so rapidly. Samuel Francis bought it on January 16, 1762 for £2,000. If I did my math right, that's over $700,000 today. And he named it the Queen's Head Tavern, but it popularly became Francis Tavern. Played a major role in revolutionary activities, as you probably know. On December 4th, 1783, George Washington bade his troops farewell in the Long Room, and there is the Long Room. And for those of you who want to argue that Francis Tavern is not an 18th century construction, this room is almost 100% intact. Well, how can that be? because at one point Francis Tavern looked very different. That's true. Two devastating fires in the building in the 19th century caused it to be rebuilt, but only from about the third story up. So notice here, it still has a peaked roof, although it's not the roof we know today. And then here, in a later rebuild in the 1860s, you'll see that it looks just like every other building on the block. So to our perspective, it doesn't look like an 18th century building at all. But when the Sons of the Revolution bought the building and restored and opened it as a museum in 1970, they discovered that more than 60% of the original 18th century building was still intact, to the point where they were able to recreate the roof line perfectly because of the surviving beams that were charred from the past fires, but they could still restore the building. So bear with me. This is the oldest building on Manhattan Island. Today it's a museum. I invite you all to visit it. It's also a wonderful place to grab lunch or dinner. I love this building. I love going there, and the food's good. Now we're going to jump ahead 30 years to the Old Coffee House. Yes, folks, ye was pronounced the back in the day. 105 Broad Street, on a plot owned by Philip Van Cortlandt. The Sons of Liberty used it as a meeting house beginning in 1765. This was more of a hotbed of revolutionary activity than Francis Tavern. A bell hung outside it to summon people to arms in 1776 after the Declaration of Independence was read for the first time right here in Bowling Green. So we're here, right practically next to Francis Tavern. It had a very colorful history as offices for various shipping concerns, headquarters for several workers' organizations, etc. And here it is, looking nothing like an 18th century building today. Here's Francis Tavern in its recreated form. Here's another building which complements Francis Tavern, so you get a sense of 18th century scale. But this building doesn't look 18th century at all. That's because in 1882, George F. Pelham modernized the structure, adding 2 more floors and a pub. There's still a pub there today. In 1905, I guess by then it was Ye Old Lindinger's Tavern, was a super popular meeting place until Prohibition put it out of business. And today it is, yeah. Today it's forgotten and ignored. There's not even a plaque on this building mentioning its incredibly significant role in the American Revolution. That's got to be changed. Now we're going to jump uptown to that building at 65 Jumel Terrace, built by Colonel Roger Morris and Mary Phillips as their country home. It was a Palladian structure with a wonderful octagonal building, a library behind it. And there it is out in the woods. Even in 1811, it's out in the woods. Washington slept here in September and October of 1776. It served as British headquarters for the rest of the Revolution. Don't forget, New York City was occupied by the British from 1776 until they abandoned it in 1783. The building itself was seized by the federal government because the Morrises were British sympathizers. And at that point, it was converted into a lowly public house. And here's the kitchen of the building, which was part of the tavern in the 1780s and early 1800s. Broadway was not far away, and this was a very active public house. Stephen and Eliza Jumel bought it in 1810, renovated it, modernized it, and entertained the likes of Louis Philippe, Lafayette, Henry Clay, Joseph Bonaparte, etc. This is supposedly Joseph Bonaparte's bed. Yes, that Bonaparte. And in 1833, Eliza, now a widow, married Aaron Burr for a year before she couldn't stand him anymore, and resumed her identity as the widow Jumel. She was a very controversial character. We could spend an entire hour just talking about her. It continued to be a private country house until 1903, when it became a city-run historic house and park. It is open to the public. It is delightful. You can take the subway or a bus up there, and I really, really recommend the Morris Jamel Mansion. Jumping back down to what's now City Hall Park, which was originally the New York Commons, St. Paul's Chapel, 1766 at 209 Broadway at Fulton Street. There's an engraving of it. It has changed extremely little since this engraving was made. This building was incredibly significant in American Revolutionary history. There's a photo of it today. There is another engraving of it showing you just how little it has changed. It was built in the country to serve those north of the city who found it too difficult to come into the city itself for services on a Sunday. The main entrance faces the river because that's how people were getting to it. This is the back of the church. The portico was added several years later as traffic began to increase on Broadway and people began entering from the rear of the building. Washington worshipped here during his presidency, the first part of his presidency, because Trinity Church itself was in ruins after the fire of 1776, and it is the oldest church building in New York City. And many of you probably recall that it played a hugely important role during the 9/11 attacks as well. This was a way station and a processing station, a place of refuge. I'm sure many of you remember those days and how important this church was to service the needs of the community and the survivors of 9/11. Here is the original front of the church. It faces the river, and there is the graveyard, which is also worth visiting. It's an 18th century graveyard. And wait a minute, did I say graveyards? There are several graveyards in Manhattan that date back to the 17th and 18th centuries. There's one on Duane Street, 26 Duane Street, which is the African burial ground. It's a modern setting now. It does not look like a 17th or 18th century graveyard. Well worth a visit. It's just north of City Hall. I really encourage you all to visit. It's very moving. It's very beautiful. Trinity Church Graveyard dates back to 1697, so that's the 17th century. Yes, Alexander Hamilton is buried there, but a whole lot of other people are too. St. Paul's Graveyard, 1766, when that church was constructed. And the photo I'm showing you here is the first Shirith Israel burial ground. There are 3 of them. This one on Pearl Street near Chatham Square, also one on West 11th near 6th Avenue, and the third one on West 21st Street near 6th Avenue. The 3 graveyards span the 17th through the 19th century. You cannot enter them except during extremely special circumstances or by special permission. You can walk right by them and peer through the gates. And by the way, anytime you go for a stroll in Washington Square, there are still an estimated 10,000 graves underneath the square because Washington Square was a potter's field from 1797, 18th century, to 1826. And there is another wonderful grave in the city that's worth mentioning, although the stone is not 18th century. Up on Riverside Drive at 122nd Street, a monument to an amiable child. This was built for the Monte Alta estate on Strawberry Hill, the home of George Pollock, an Irish linen dealer. His son, St. Clair Pollock, then aged 5, fell from the cliff at the edge of this estate and was killed. He was interred with a marble marker in the Pollock family plot. Unfortunately, the Pollocks lost the estate in 1799. Ultimately, it became Claremont, a famous destination as an inn up at the northern reaches of Riverside Drive, just north of Grant's Tomb. And after Grant's Tomb opened, this quaint little marble stone, which was replaced by an exact copy in the late 1890s, was often visited, and people had the nasty habit of chipping off pieces of it as souvenirs. So in 1967, an exact copy in granite, much more durable, was installed. This is, by the way, the only 18th century relic, and I put surviving in quotes because it's not really 18th century, just the plot is, surviving on the Upper West Side, which was once called Bloomingdale and which was full of 18th century villas. I gave a talk about that in the recent past, which is on YouTube. If you look for Up the Old Bloomingdale Road with my name associated to it, you can enjoy a stroll up a street that doesn't exist anymore. Captain Joseph Rose's house, otherwise known as the Rat Pit, at 273 Water Street, 1773. I wrote a colorful history to say the least. This is right by the Seaport District, and there is a photo of it taken just 6 months ago. Colorful history is right. When Rose built this house as his private home, his pier projected into the East River from the rear of this house. He and his partner, William Late Street, shared the pier where they imported mahogany. In the 19th century, Water Street became a notorious location because of the sailors, the taverns, and the brothels. And in 1863, Christopher Kit Burns, one of the original Dead Rabbits, by the way, of Gangs of New York fame, bought the house and converted it into Sportsman's Hall. This is an engraving of Sportsman's Hall, where bare knuckle boxing, dancing, drinking, and dog and rat fights took place. No time to talk about it today, but if you're interested, go onto Google and look up about dog and rat fights in New York City in the 19th century. It's horrible. It's really horrible. Really changes your concept of the good old days for sure. By 1870, pressure from the community forced Burns to sell the house to the Williamsburg Methodist Home as a shelter for abandoned women. And by the 1970s, the building itself was abandoned. But with the revival of the Seaport area, it was converted into 4 very desirable apartments. Those are the doorbells. So something changed between that last house and the next one we're going to talk about. Yep, we became an independent country. So everything you've seen up until now was a building that was constructed under British rule. But from this point on, it's the US of A. This first one is particularly interesting. The Dyckman farmhouse, built in 1783 up at Broadway and 204th Street. I hope a lot of you have been up there to visit it. It's an amazing survivor of early times. It's a Dutch-style farmhouse in the middle of basically, I guess, Washington Heights or whatever you want to call it, Fort Triumph, up there. Now, what's significant is that it replaced the farmhouse that was burned by the British during the Revolutionary War because the Dykmans were colonial sympathizers. So they rebuilt the building by and large the way it had been. So it's a 1783 farmhouse that replicates a farmhouse from much earlier in the century. The land, by the way, had been in the family since 1661. In 1868, the farm was subdivided and auctioned off, the largest single owner property auction in New York City history. By the late 19th century, the farmhouse was in serious disrepair. You know, people did not, well, people still don't value old buildings. Let's be honest about that. The vast majority of people don't really care, which is why an organization like Village Preservation is so important. But in the late 19th century, sisters Mary Alice Dyckman Dean and Fanny Frederica Dyckman Welch, are you getting, there's a theme there, presented to the house in the city, and they told their husbands, guess what, guys, you're restoring it. And yeah, they had nothing to say about this. So for a year, Mr. Dean and Mr. Welch worked like farmhands, restoring the house. It's a wonderful place to visit. It opened as a museum in July of 1916, and it has a wonderfully varied programming series which caters to the community, which is such a diverse community. I urge you all to go up and see it. It's a wonderful place for a visit. The Edward Mooney House, said to be the oldest row house on Manhattan Island, was built in 1789 at 18 Bowery, just north of Chatham Square. He was a wholesale meat seller, and he bought the property at the Delancey auction of seized assets after the Revolution. And there's a snap of the house taken a little while ago. Here's another snap. It's the oldest, and it's federal style, by the way. That's important to understand. Not that different from Georgian, but there are some telltale differences, mostly around the window frames and the door frame. The ground floor has been revamped many, many times. It was a tavern, a hotel, a brothel. I think every building before 1860 in New York was at one point or another a brothel. It became a restaurant, a store, and a Chinese club. Its most recent incarnation was a bank. So there are some original 1789 details upstairs, but on the ground floor, which you used to be able to walk into, it's completely unrecognizable. Here's a photo of the ground floor that I took 6 months ago. It is undergoing yet another in its series of renovations. I've not been back recently, so I don't know how far we've gotten with this. I snapped this through the window, by the way, and the workers were looking at me very suspiciously. The James B. Watson House, the Elizabeth Seton Shrine at 7 State Street. State Street was just one of the best blocks in the city in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. This house faced the Battery Park, or what was then Battery Park. It was much smaller than it is today. There's the house in this engraving from the very early 1800s. The house was designed by John McComb Jr. Watson was a Yale grad, a successful importer-exporter, and a state and federal senator. Super important New York and American history going on in this building. Hamilton and Washington were among his frequent guests. These photos were taken during the HABS study, Historic American Building Service Study series, survey study in the 1930s. I'm trying to get it all in my allotted time here. Look at this architecture. Washington and Hamilton walked up and down those steps, walked through that door, warmed their hands at that fireplace mantle. It's so beautiful. In 1806, Moses Rogers bought the house and the one next door, which is this flat house here, and added the colonnade to connect the two of them. By the mid-century, as the neighborhood was undergoing transformation, obviously, from a residential neighborhood to a commercial neighborhood, the Customs House was there, the Stock Exchange was there, the Cotton Exchange was nearby. It held government offices and was surrounded by commercial buildings. Here's a photo even later in the century. The Catholic Church bought it in 1870 as a mission home for Irish immigrant girls. So right as they were getting off the pier from Ellis Island, well, at this point it was still Castle Garden, you either fell into the hands of some unscrupulous agent trying to either spirit you away to some fate worse than death, or get you into some working situation that was not all that desirable. But the Catholic Church representatives were also standing there, herding up as many of the Irish immigrant girls as they could to bring them to the mission home and then send them out into the world under better circumstances. Also, this is where the steerage survivors, not the first or second class survivors, but the steerage survivors of Titanic, this is where they were brought for processing. So much history in this building. Today, it is still owned by the Catholic Church. There's a nice big sign at the front gate which says private, AKA go away. And it was depressing to go up and look at this building and think of what it should be and what it's not. These two openings to the lower level of the building were filled with trash. So, hey, what can we do to save this building? Speaking of which, another endangered building, an 18th century tavern at 279 Water Street. This was back when Water Street was still a good neighborhood, and it was built as a grocery store and malt shop to service the many elegant brick homes like the Rose House we saw just down the street. But The neighborhood declined rapidly, and there was a rapid change in owners in this building, each one of them catering to a rougher and rougher clientele. This was the site of bait and drug crimes. You know, those famous stories about getting a sailor just so inebriated or so drugged that they passed out completely. Then they would basically rob them blind and push them out a trap door. They'd wake up on the sidewalk. True stories. This was inhabited by prostitutes. There was at least one murder conducted in this building and a multitude of other crimes. On March 30th, 1878, the area, including this house, was raided. Nearly 24 prostitutes were jailed in that raid. In 1888, the building was modernized, so the roof was raised and Victorian details hid its age. Before that, it would have been just these two stories with a pitched roof and dormer windows above it. You'll notice by now that any building that has not been substantially altered in this talk all have pitched roofs, because until the second quarter of the 19th century, roofing technology did not exist to allow someone to make a flat roof. So they were all pitched roofs. You see a pitched roof with dormer windows, it's a clue to its age. The building remained a bar until Prohibition, when it became a very, very thinly disguised restaurant. When South Street Seaport revival began, it was converted into the Bridge Cafe, of which many of us, I'm sure, have very fond memories. The Bridge Cafe took a major hit during Superstorm Sandy, and they're still trying to pull this building back from the edge. This is a photo I snapped where the restaurant used to be 6 months ago, but the owners are very hopeful that the building can be reopened, so let's hope so. The Stuyvesant House at 44 Stuyvesant Street. 1795. It is the oldest building on Manhattan Island to have only ever served as a residence, as a private house. This is the oldest building to have never been converted into something other than a private house. I think just that alone is so cool. Sorry, I'm stuck. Okay, there we go. It was recently for sale. I could not find out whether the sale went through, but in June of this year, it was under contract for $6,750,000, the first time in its history that it was sold since it was built. Always owned by the family until June 2023. I think the sale went through, but I could not find any documentation, possibly because it was so recent. If you're standing there gawking at the Stuyvesant House, then why not take a stroll on Stuyvesant Street while you're there? The Hamilton Fish House, a little later, 1803, at 21 Stuyvesant Street, built by Petrus Stuyvesant, Peter Stuyvesant's great-grandson. The St. Mark's Historic District is so worth an hour's stroll. It includes St. Mark's and the Bowery, which we're going to be talking about shortly. And it's just a wonderful opportunity to explore a beautiful block in a really cool neighborhood with a lot of excellent local shops and restaurants. Part of the fun of going to look at historic buildings is what's around them as well. Quick leap across some water to the Blackwell House, built on Blackwell's Island in 1796. The island, it's the only other farmhouse surviving in the borough of New York, of Manhattan, by the way. Originally, Blackwell's Island was called Hog Island. The land was not all that fertile, so it was very, very hard to make the island work. During the Revolution, the British used it as a penal colony. So I suppose you were luckier being on this island than you were in the prison ships in Wallabout Bay, but probably not by much. James Blackwell built this attractive farmhouse in 1796. The city purchased the island in 1828, built a smallpox hospital, an almshouse, penitentiary, and several other institutional buildings. And this building was pretty much left to its own devices during that time period. The island became Welfare Island in 1921, and the buildings, which we're all probably pretty familiar with, if for no other reason than just driving up the FDR Drive. And you can see a lot of the ruins of the later buildings on the island. The farmhouse was rescued during the 1970s when the island was redeveloped as Roosevelt Island, and it's now a community center for the island residents. So you're welcome to walk in, but you're going to see very little 18th century in it. This I find very interesting. 134 Bowery, the oldest surviving spec house that I know of, built on the island of Manhattan. So this was not commissioned by an owner, it was built as spec. And if you look at the print on the left of your screen, you'll see a lot of very elegant houses, townhouses. This is the Bowery. In the early 1820s, that's the Bowery Playhouse, the Bowery Theater there in its earliest incarnation. If you look at these two houses just left of the Bowery Theater, you'll get an idea of what I'm about to show you. But by the 1830s, this had all succumbed to commercial pressures, and the Bowery was no longer an elegant residential avenue. Here they are today. 134, and I also included 136 with a question mark, because there's some argument as to whether or not 136 is contemporary with 134 or was built in the 1820s. The records are a little unclear about this, but you'll notice certainly the scale, the fenestration is identical. And if you keep the 3 bays on the 2 upper stories here and take the 2 dormers and bring them over there, you'll get a better idea of what 134 originally looked like. And I showed you an engraving of what it looked like just before. The buildings became a library, millinery shops, bookshops, insurance brokers, a gunsmith, boarding houses, and very significantly, a very important stop in the Underground Railroad from the 1840s through the Civil War. Really important in the history of equal rights, of slavery, of the Underground Railroad, super important, which may be the key to keeping these buildings from being destroyed because they are endangered constantly. The Bowery branch of the YMCA opened here in 1872, which is very cool as well. There were temperance meetings on Monday evenings in the Carmel Chapel, ultimately became a pool hall. The artist Eva Hess and her husband, sculptor Tom Doyle, lived at 134, this one, the left one, in the 1960s. Let's preserve these buildings. Let's keep them forever. Important history. St. Mark's in the Bowery, 1799 East 10th Street at 2nd Avenue. It was built on the site of the Stuyvesant family chapel in their Bowery. Bowery just means farm in Dutch. And Peter Stuyvesant's grave is in the graveyard of this church, another 18th century graveyard. It was the first Episcopal church built independently of Trinity Church in the New World. So prior to this time, all Episcopal churches in the original 13 colonies were subject to Trinity Church. This is the first one that was independent of Trinity Church. Designed by John McComb Jr., again, rah-rah John McComb Jr., and it was an elegant, rustic sort of country church, but elegant because 2nd Avenue was a very elegant block, avenue, neighborhood, whatever you want to call it in those days. And that would be an interesting talk to give about the transformation of 2nd Avenue. You pay attention, William? Maybe that's something we can talk about doing down the road. Oh, I'm making work for myself. The steeple was added in 1828. The interior redesigned in a Grecian style in 1836. The porch added in 1858, probably by James Bogardus, who was the inventor, for lack of a better word, of cast iron architecture. So again, a super significant building. The church gradually became involved with many alternative and counterculture artists and poets, the beatniks, the Beat Generation, bebop, all sorts of stuff went on here. In 1978, a catastrophic fire nearly destroyed the building and completely gutted the interior. This is the interior today, folks. So it was repaired and rebuilt and reopened and it remains very active in the modern cultural life of New York City. A great place to go for events. The Mount Vernon Hotel Museum, 1799. Some of you may remember this as the Abigail Adams Smith Museum, which is what it was called for a long period of time. I don't recall exactly when the names changed, I think in the 1990s. In 1795, Colonel William Stephen Smith and his wife, Abigail Adams Smith, the daughter of John Adams and Abigail Adams, began developing their 23-acre estate, but they ran out of money. In 1798, prosperous merchant William T. Robinson purchased Mount Vernon, very creative name they gave the estate, but I think with their connections, you understand why, and completed the project, this being the carriage house. And this painting in the lower left corner shows the dock at the foot of 61st Street in the first half of the 19th century at some point. And it's very probable that that building at the top of the dock is the Mount Vernon Hotel Museum. This is a more recognizable image of it. Shortly after Robinson purchased the property, it opened as a very popular country resort called the Mount Vernon Hotel. People traveled up there from the city for a day trip, for an overnight, to enjoy the bucolic views and the fresh country air in the early 19th century. In 1823, it became a girls' academy. In 1826, the main house burned and the property was subdivided. So remember, this was the carriage house of the estate. Jeremiah Toll and his family lived in the converted carriage house from 1833 until 1905, when it was sold to the gas company. And yeah, so we have proof that it was definitely owned by the gas company. These are three huge illuminating gas storage tanks, because illuminating gas was still used in the early 20th century. And one could argue that these frightening structures may be what saved this building from being demolished. It's such a charmer of a building. 1924, the Colonial Dames of America restored the house and opened it as a museum honoring its Adams connection. Since then, it has now been converted to interpret the country resort years. It's at the foot of East 61st Street. I really encourage you all to go and visit it. Be aware that a lot of these museums that are open to the public do not have elevators inside them. We'll talk about that momentarily. Gracie Mansion, another East River estate, built in 1799. It's in Carl Schurz Park now, as you probably know. Constructed by Archibald Gracie, who owned the largest fleet of merchant ships in New York. On a strategic location overlooking the East River, on ruins of an estate which had been bombarded to smithereens by the British during the Revolution. That is definitely a strategic location if you see the star there. Facing pretty much Hellgate, by the way, and that's a whole nother talk. It was considered the best of the elegant estates which lined the East River back in the day, attributed to John Macomb Jr. It's very likely built by him. Gracie sadly lost the estate because he went broke as a result of the War of 1812 and the embargo against shipping in America. There were two subsequent owners, but in 1896, the estate, consisting of 11 acres, was appropriated by New York City to create Carl Schurz Park, a hero of the German-American community. The mansion became public toilets and an ice cream concession. But Mrs. John King Van Rensselaer, I think you might recognize that as an early New York family, rescued the house and made it a museum in 1924. It's now the official residence of His Honor the Mayor and open for tours. I recommend that you call before going to make sure that the museum, the house, is open on the day you want to go. Its hours are sporadic, depending obviously on what's going on in it. But it's so worth a visit. It's gorgeous. It's really beautiful. Which brings me to a surprise. And I want to, wow, I'm talking as fast as I can, everybody. One would think that when I went to research this talk, I just typed in 18th century structures on Manhattan Island. No, it was not that easy at all. There is no website to date that is complete and lists all of these structures. And through the course of my research, I kept finding things in the most serendipitous ways. This being an example. I knew that the fence surrounding Bowling Green dated to the 18th century, but I did not know that there's a second 18th century fence cordoning off St. Peter's, Chelsea from the sidewalk, which dates back to 1788, which is a neat trick because St. Peter's, Chelsea does not date to 1788. These are both hand-wrought iron. You can walk right up to them and run your hands along them. It's so wonderful to be able to examine these two fences. And as I said, there's lots of history associated with them. Let's go to the older one first. Bowling Green at the foot of Broadway was originally a cow pasture in Dutch times. In 1638, that's what it was put aside for, and declared a park by the British in 1733, the oldest park in New York. In 1770, an equestrian gilt-lead statue of King George III, as I wrote, was famously installed here. We probably all know the story of the gilded lead, I can't speak, gilt lead statue of King George that was erected here and created a whole lot of problems. A fence had to be installed 3 years later in 1773 to keep people out of the park at night from vandalizing the statue. And finally, in 1776, an example of early cancel culture, the statue was toppled. That painting shows a very romanticized version of the toppling, and melted into bullets. As the Patriots said, we're going to return King George's statue to him as bullets. But the fence remained, although if you look down here at the lower right-hand corner, you can see the finials have been sawed off. People are not sure whether they were crowns or some sort of royal emblem. But anyway, all the finials were sawed off at the same time, and no one ever bothered replacing them. So go down to Bowling Green, which is a beautiful park and an amazingly historic part of the town, and, you know, run your hands along the fence. But what about St. Peter's, Chelsea? The church was constructed in 1738, which was 50 years after the fence was constructed. This fence originally surrounded the second Trinity Church, which was constructed in 1788 on the ruins of the first, which was destroyed in the Great Fire of 1776. And if you look at the print down below, there's Trinity Church with the fence in front of it, and another church right next to it, Grace Church. So Grace Church did not always exist up at the bend in Broadway. It was originally right next door to Trinity Church and a chapel for Trinity Church. And when the new Trinity Church began construction, the replacement by Richard Upjohn, this fence was removed and given to St. Peter's, Chelsea. You can see from the photos, it's just beautiful. So just under the wire, literally time-wise and figuratively because of the date, here is the newest 18th century structure in Manhattan, the 1800 Isaac Hendricks House at 77 Bedford Street. And this is the image that Village Preservation chose to show for the blurb, the online posting for this talk, because it's in the village. It was a freestanding wooden house surrounded by gardens built by Joshua Isaac in a mix of old and new styles. The gambrel roof is definitely 18th century and dates back to Dutch times. His son-in-law, Harmon Hendricks, is said to be America's first millionaire. Together, they made a fortune in copper production. Hendricks amassed a huge amount of real estate. 77 Bedford was used as a rental property after his father-in-law moved out. And it has many stories to tell, doubtless. In 1836, it received a brick veneer facade. In 1923, the estate was liquidated, and 77 Bedford and a number of adjoining properties were targeted to be sold for development as large buildings. but local artists purchased them as multi-unit buildings in order to save them. Here's a photo of the building shortly in the late 1920s when they had been saved by artists. A number of people ask me about those two brick panels on the side of the building. You'll notice they correspond to the chimneys up above. This is a wood frame structure. So that sort of intense heat from fires that were being used to heat the house up against a wooden structure like that bode trouble. And so the masonry on the side of the building was designed to protect the wooden structure of the house from the intense heat of the fires. This also tells us that originally, when the building was first constructed, there were no fireplaces upstairs. The building was heated exclusively by those two fireplaces. It must have been kind of chilly. The building was decrepit by 1989. Our own hero, Michael Devonshire, a former commissioner of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, worked on the team which restored it. Jacqueline Thion de la Chaume was the woman who bought it and had it restored as a single family home. She was the third wife of Yul Brynner. Well, folks, we have run out of time. So I was going to talk about a few 19th century buildings as well, but I do want to just drop a blurb. Forgive me. Don't look, don't look, don't look, don't look, don't look. I want to encourage you to visit the Merchants House Museum. 1832, yes, but the mentality, the aesthetic values, the construction methods date right back to the 18th century. What's changed basically are the details. Take away the acanthus leaves and you've got basically a very grand 18th century house. And I have a plug for myself or plug for the videos. Go onto YouTube and type in Behind the Ropes, Bellov. And these three talks that I give about the Merchants House will come up. I think you'll find them extremely informative and interesting, though they deal with the 19th century structure and the decorative arts of the 19th century. I delve into the 18th century constantly through them. One of them is about the architecture of the building. One is about the furniture, the original furniture collection that the family owned who lived in the building. And the third is about domestic lighting, which brings me to Salmagundi, of which I am a member. Yes, the outside does not look 18th century at all, but I have had golden opportunity to give 3 talks open to the building is open to the public, called Before Salmagundi, which Village Preservation, thank you very much. They are also on YouTube. If you type in Before Salmagundi and then my name, they'll pop right up. And even as late as 1853, since I had a chance to examine the construction detail of this wonderful mansion, the oldest mansion surviving on Fifth Avenue, it's still an 18th century structure in terms of construction techniques, in terms of awareness and aesthetic taste. So that, my friends, brings us to the end of my talk. If you visit historic buildings, expect stairs and other ADA issues. This photo is of the staircase at the Merchants House. No elevator in that building because the house is landmark both inside and out. Call ahead, as I mentioned, to make sure that the building is open when you want to go visit it. Anticipate a certain amount of discomfort. Not all of these old house museums have air conditioning or cafes. There might be no available seating. But when you go visit one of these buildings, especially in a neighborhood you're not familiar with, check out the neighborhood. Walk around for a couple of blocks and see what's there. They're in such diverse places, and New York being New York, there are treasures and wonderful things like shops and restaurants to discover everywhere around these buildings. They all have strong online presences, so even if for some reason you're unable to visit the building itself, for instance, you might not be able to deal with a lot of staircases, check out their online presences because there is so much online that can substitute, at least partly. And finally, a plug to Tom Miller's Daytonian in Manhattan blog post. If you're not reading this blog post regularly, then you should. Tom Miller posts a new building in Manhattan every day, 6 days a week. He takes the day off on Sundays, and he delves deeply into many of these buildings. So, with that, I turn it back over to William, and thank you very much for your attention, everybody.
All right, all I'm getting from the audience, Anthony, is encore, encore, encore. So you'll definitely have to be coming back because we want to hear what the rest of your presentation was that we didn't get to squeeze out today.
Well,
But
gee
thank you
whiz.
so much. Thank you so much. And I can definitely recommend the Dykeman Farmhouse. I live only a few blocks from it. It is an absolute treat to visit. There's also a little reconstruction of a Hessian cabin that they have in the back there. So very, very cool. And I love the Seaport Plug. That's my old stomping ground. I used to lead a sex and murder tour of Water Street. So I'm
Oh,
very
fun.
familiar with the rat pit and all that good stuff down there. All right, folks, if you have any questions for Anthony, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A. There are a few questions already here, so let's go away with them. All
Sure.
right. So we have one. Is there any truth to the claim that until it was closed because of Sandy, that the Bridge Cafe was the oldest continuously operated tavern in New York City?
Um, there are at least three places that I can think of that all claim that. Yeah, sure, there's a certain amount of truth in it. Um, I'm not the person that's going to argue the point, but let's say it's definitely one of the absolutely oldest taverns in New York City that was continuously operated. I don't want to step on the other places. So I'm going to say, yeah, maybe.
Another Bridge Cafe question, and I'm glad this person brought it up. But was that the place where Gallus Mag used to work?
I'm going to let you answer this, William, because you know better than I.
So yeah, Gallus Mag is the great legend of the 6 foot tall lady bouncer of the Bridge Cafe, and I don't want to take too long, but she used to wear trousers, had a club and a pistol, sharpened her teeth down to points, and then if you didn't pay your bar tab, she'd take a souvenir from you, usually your ear, or occasionally your finger, and kept it in a vat of alcohol in the back of the bar. So please go ahead and read the book Gangs of New York. You get to read all these fascinating urban legends from 19th Street, New York.
I didn't
Well,
pay my tab twice.
lucky you only have two missing fingers.
Really, it's hard to play the piano without them, though.
All right. The other question, why was Governor's Island not mentioned? Are there no 18th century survivors on
You
Governor's
know,
Island?
that is a very good question. Thank you very much. There is some argument about the governor's house on Governor's Island, but the best indicators that I could find is that it's an extremely early 19th century building, like 1801, 1802. I'm going to revisit that, but I'm going to say there is nothing 18th century surviving above ground in Governor's Island. I'm also going to interject for those who don't know. Governor's Island was the site of the initial Dutch settlement. Before they moved onto Manhattan Island, they set up an outpost on Governor's Island because it was easier to defend.
Yeah, 400 years next year.
Hey, hey, let's party.
All right. Then a couple questions on, have you developed a walking tour based on this incredible presentation? And if someone wanted to put their own walking tour together, what kind of order or area would you focus a walking tour
Wow. So you're asking me for tips to develop your tour.
on?
Okay. I would mention that this whole PowerPoint presentation is copyright, but you ask a very good question because when I was preparing the initial presentation, I've changed it substantially since then. But of course, the information is the information. one day I walked from Battery Park all the way up to 20th Street to see the fence around St. Peter's, Chelsea. And when you do a walking tour like that, you really appreciate where things are on the island and where they are in relation to each other. It was 7 miles in total because I clocked myself with my little heart app on my iPhone. Not that the one is 7 miles from the other, but going from one place to the other and zigzagging up the island, you wind up uh, clocking about 7 miles. Obviously, you cannot do a walking tour where you start with France's Tavern and then wind up at the Morris Jumel Mansion. It's just not going to happen because they are at opposite ends of the island. It's a I would say it's a difficult walking tour to do, but certainly you could do the ones that are all clustered in the within the city limits of the 18th century. Definitely.
And wasn't there a historic plaque on the Isaac Hendricks house at the southwest corner of Bedford and Commerce? Do you have any idea what happened to that
I
plaque?
am not familiar with that at all. I don't recall ever having seen a plaque on the building. I don't know.
And then we have, so who owned the house at 44 Stuyvesant Street between 1952 and its most recent sale? Wasn't it that the last Stuyvesant died in 1952? So who inherited the house after that?
Yikes. I don't know. It was certainly in the Stuyvesant estate. And I don't know the answer to that question, but we'd have to do a little bit of digging to find out. But my understanding was it remained within the estate. So whoever owned the house afterwards inherited it, did not purchase it. This was the first time since the house was built that it was on the open market.
And then someone posted that they found on Street Easy that 44 Stuyvesant was sold for 6.5 million on the 28th of July this year.
Okay, great. Thanks for that update. That's terrific.
All right, and that was the last of our questions. All right, thank you so much, Anthony. That was amazing. I really loved the part about the 18th century fences. That was something I had no idea about. That was super, super cool. I really
Isn't that
liked that.
cool? Isn't that cool? I knew about Battery Park, of course, because of the story with filing off the crowns and all that. But the one on 20th Street, so cool. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anthony. So before you all take off again, just a reminder, please check out these upcoming events at Village Preservation the week after Thanksgiving. And if you are not a member as of yet, I hope Anthony's amazing presentation inspired you to become a member of Village Preservation. You can just scan this handy dandy QR code right on your screen, and it will take you right to villagepreservation.org/donate. So again, Anthony, thank you so much. That was super, super fascinating and so much fun and so
You're
many
welcome.
interesting things to cover. And thank you all of you for joining us this evening. We wish you a great rest of your evening and hope you'll join us at future village preservation events. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.